Hi everyone, it's William. I finally maybe found a resolution to this daily problem of doing videos in the afternoon and having the sun low on the horizon. So it's not ideal. I'm revealing the dirty underside of the roof here and this post that needs to be stained, but nonetheless, other than that, it seems fine. So this is the 1921 diary entry. We are up to the 27th of January, which made it the 14th of February on the Gregorian calendar, and Valentine's Day. So I meant to look it up to see if Valentine's Day was a thing at that time and whether it was or still is a thing in any country outside of the United States. In fact, I spoke to a friend in Paris this morning, and if I had looked ahead, I would have asked him about that. But if it is something that is done in France now, that's celebrated in France now, I assume that, like Halloween, it's because it has spread through popular culture from the US, from Hollywood movies and that sort of thing. But anyway, Dmitri was not celebrating Valentine's Day or making any mention of it, so I just don't think it was going on. All right, and one other thing, what is going on with our friend? This is quite a change on his part. Usually he starts with the day, the month, the year, the day of the week, the city where he's writing, and then, of course, his address. But this time he has the day, the month, the year, the day of the week, his address, and then the city. What the heck? He's such he's got such an ingrained habit of doing it the other way. He must have been distracted. I'm being facetious, of course, but it's kind of funny. All right, here we go with the diary entry. General Dubinsky. Where's the stress in that? Dubinsky. Probably Dubinsky. Came to see me in the morning. He talked a long time about his impressions of Stavka during the abdication of the sovereign. Then about a letter he recently received from a certain general working on the staff of the Red Army in Petrograd. That general is not talking about what's going on in Soviet so much as he's asking what's happening abroad. And that's very interesting because one can see, reading between the lines, that some kind of work is going on in Russia. For lunch, I went to Maria's, then did some writing at home. Around 5 o'clock, I went to see Coco Chanel at the Ritz. I dined at Charlie's and spent the evening with her. I got home late. Okay, nice short diary entry, but lots going on. So who was General Dubinsky to begin with? Well, he was Dmitri Nikolaevich. He was 65 years old that year, and he would be dead within 2 years in 1923. He was a genstabist, which is the Russian word for a member of the general staff. So he was an important man and strategist, and he'd started out in the artillery and then went to the General Staff Academy. And he would side with Nikolasha at headquarters. So Stavka is the Russian word for headquarters, and he would be on the side of Nikolasha, not surprisingly, because the general staff officers sort of were all on the same page, including Nikolasha himself, who was also a graduate of the General Staff Academy, and there were deep ties apparently that came from that. If you were at the General Staff Academy and if you became part of the General Staff when you were doing your active service, it was like a kind of fraternity, and it was sort of the intellectuals, and they were all relatively liberal leaning. I say relative, of course, because for the most part they weren't what you would call outright liberals, but they were centrists and they were moderates. Okay, so, but somehow or other, apparently, he managed to stay on at headquarters after Nikolai Nikolaevich was sent packing to the Caucasus by Nicholas II, and so he's telling Dmitri what things were like at Stavka Dmitri says, during the abdication of the sovereign. We know, of course, that Nicholas did not abdicate at Stavka. He abdicated on the imperial train en route to Petersburg, I think, to Petrograd, as it was called at that time, or trying to get home to Tsarskaya Selo. So I'm not sure if General Dubiensky was present, but he, as a general staff member, would have been in on what was going on with the other general staff officers, and this was less a revolution than a military coup at that point. So Dmitri was, by that time, himself in exile in Persia, and so naturally he's interested in this. But there's also a little business involved in this meeting between him and General Dubiensky. So the general has brought him information. Dmitri has now formed or delegated other people to form this information bureau to gather information about specifically what's going on in Russia among the Soviets. And General Dubiensky apparently has information about that because he is actually in direct and recent contact with a general, Genstabis, a general in the general staff of the Red Army, so quite high up. So that's interesting, and I was trying to figure out who this might have been, and my immediate guess was that it was General Alexei Ignatiev, the so-called Red General. He was a member of the aristocratic Ignatiev family in Russia. They were at court, they were in the diplomatic corps, they were high up in the military, but he chose to stay loyal to, he chose the Reds over the Whites, over the Tsarist Russians, and he could easily have joined the White movement because he was in Paris at the time of the revolution. He was a diplomat there. And in fact, so it was very much by choice that he opted to join the Reds. And in fact, he did them this great favor because there were millions of so the ruble wasn't worth much at that time, but I think it was actually gold rubles that the Russian government, for whatever reason, had in France, in a bank in France, and the Red government wasn't even aware of it. But Ignatiev brought that to their attention, and they ended up getting that money. It had belonged to the Russian government, and so, yeah, they got that money. I'm not sure what year that was. And he remained in Paris, General Ignatiev, and went back to Russia in the 1930s, died there in the 1950s. He wrote a fascinating volume of memoirs. He had been a diplomat in Sweden at the time when Dmitri's sister had married and gone to Sweden, and he talked about what a difficult adjustment she had to that at first. And his memoirs are fascinating because he talks specifically about how he went as a young army officer to the General Staff Academy and became completely disillusioned with the way the Russian army was being run, because the people at the General Staff Academy specifically were so imbued with this idea of this Petrine idea, going back to Peter the Great, of preserving Russia's great power status no matter what. And they saw the rot going on in the rest of the army, and they became disillusioned, and Nikolai Nikolaevich was exposed to that same circle of people who were very unhappy with what they viewed as the corruption and incompetence in Russia at that time, in the government, in the military. So, you could have seen the writing on the wall that Ignatieff might have supported the Reds, although my guess would be that he lived to regret it. I don't know. I've never... Did I read his memoirs all the way through, or did I only read the Imperial Russian section? Probably only the Imperial Russian section, because I was specifically... That was when I was doing research for my PhD, so I should really go back and read the whole thing. And I forgot to admit that General Dubiensky, who went to visit Dmitri that morning, was actually a publisher, and he'd been a publisher in Russia as well. He'd retired from the army in 1909, and he, in fact, wrote memoirs after the war, and he wrote this memoir called How the Revolution Occurred in Russia, and I've never read it, so I need to see if I can get my hands on that. So he would have been really the ideal person, assuming he was honest and didn't gild the lily or anything like that. He was an ideal person to come and talk to Dmitri, because, he was in touch. He had been a keen observer and written about the events of the revolution, and he was currently in touch with this general working on the staff of the Red Army. Dmitri calls him a certain general. So either General Dubiensky wasn't able to tell Dmitri the man's name, or willing to tell Dmitri the man's name, or Dmitri himself was unwilling to write it in his diary. We don't know which, but at some point I suppose I need to go back and take a look at the various Red generals at that time, specifically the ones who were on the general staff, and maybe I can figure it out. It's more confirmation of the fact that what Dmitri and his information bureau were interested in was specifically gathering intelligence. And so reading between the lines, apparently, it's not clear if General Dubiensky let him read this letter or read this letter to him, but he says, his expression is reading between the lines, it's clear that some kind of work is going on in Russia, and so that's a very ambiguous statement. Maybe what he means is that because it seems that this Red Army general is trying to gather intelligence on what's going on in the West through his correspondence with General Dubiensky. So it may not have been that he was secretly loyal to the Tsarist movement. It may have been that he too was trying to gather intelligence, and that seems to be the impression that Dmitri gets. So now for the social part of the diary entry, well, it's interesting that here he's saying Coco Chanel, so he's been doing that, but I just haven't made a note of it. So they're not that close as yet. He has this progression that he goes through where he starts out calling a person by their full name or their name and title. So for instance, when he first met Lady Lucia Marling in Persia, a woman with whom he became very, very close, he started out calling her Lady Lucia, and then you could see as the relationship progressed that she was just Lucia, although her husband continued to be Sir Charles and was never just Charles. Okay, so he's still calling Coco Chanel, even though they've been spending these long nights together doing God knows what, but he's also still misspelling her name. So eventually he'll catch up with how her name is supposed to be spelled, but he's spelling it in Latin letters Chanelle. So I guess he, having heard the name and not seen it in print, just guessed that that was the way it should be spelled. So now this is very interesting because he goes, he has lunch, or no, he has tea with Coco, but he has dinner with Charlie Brighton. She used to be Charlie Brighton. Now she's just Charlie, and she's this woman who who he found to be perfectly sexually compatible with him. So much so that he even writes that in his diary, that sex with her is really good. And apparently the feeling is mutual, but she has gotten a little too attached and has forbid him to see other women. So he was quite annoyed with her at one point a few diary entries ago. Well, now they can't seem to stay away from each other. At one point, early on in the diary entries, he said, you know, she's vulgar, I don't want anything to do with her anymore, but they keep going back to each other. And so he spends the evening with her, and he informs us, I got home late. So he's not doing this, sort of with her, the more sort of racy diary entries, but he does tell us that he got home late. So, you know, I think in conventional, modern American slang, you would say it was almost certainly a booty call, despite the fact that he doesn't go into any detail. So I will leave you with that. We'll go on. Tomorrow is the big meeting of the Trepov group, the Russian assembly, at which Dmitri is expected to give a report about what's going on with the Information Bureau, which is now being established. And I haven't read through that whole diary entry. I just glanced at it, so I can't tell you if there will be anything new going on with either Coco or Charlie. But anyway, come back and we'll find out about that together. All right, bye.